Hello, welcome to the presentation. So I just want to briefly explain to you the historical Pharisees and the trap of legalism and the heart of the healer. So I just want to capture the intention of the problems that Jesus Christ faced when he was facing the Pharisees in the Old Testament. So as the picture shows, it shows two contrast. So I'll be basically taking, the difference between the two. Okay, just a brief history of the Pharisees. It's called Pharisee. It's like a Hebrew term to separate. The intentions were right of them to separate themselves and give them a synthesis and a will and determine that all is foreseen, but free will is given. And they were middle class people associated with trade people, tent makers, and they not an inherited priesthood, but there were 6,000 members in the empire of 4 million Jews. And to bring the purity of the temple cult into the everyday home through strict observance of eating ritual, which are tithing and the Sabbath. So they always wanted to, give the ritual and tithing and the outward rules. They were very strict about that. And so we see the landscape of the first century Judaism. We see the three groups, Pharisees, Essenes, and Sadducees. So they believed in the resurrection and the angels and the spirits. There were Sadducees who did not believe, but in the law of interpretation, they had the oral traditions along with the law, and they were middle class people. While as Sadducees were the wealthy priests, and they all rejected oral traditions, and the Essenes were aesthetic monastic communal people. So moving on, the core conflict was the interpretation over abolition. So Jesus Christ wasn't directly against the Mosaic law as such, but he was against the interpretation of it. So it was not meant for the external things, but also the underlying principle was for justice, mercies, and human needs. So even though Jesus Christ was against the sin, but the truth, but he also was um, inherent a messenger of the grace that God had taught. So, for example, Mark 2:27, it says Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for Sabbath. So healing was violated oral traditions, but not Mosaic law. So, so in a sense, God was saying that man was made for the Sabbath, not Sabbath for the humans. So the importance is given for the humans rather than the observance of the traditions. Okay, so the Pharisaic bridge, sincere devotion. Paul of Tarsus, in regard to the law of Pharisees, circumstance of the eighth day, a Hebrew of Hebrews, and Nicodemus engaged in deep theological dialogue with Jesus and personally assisted in his burial. Gamaliel, a highly respected teacher of the law and vital force of moderation and wisdom within the Sanhedrin. So we see these people in John 3 and in Acts 5, we see Gamaliel. So they had a sincere devotion to God, and they were not inherently sinful in their intentions. The shift from the history to the heart posture. So, Pharisaical behavior occurs when religious observance shifts from a sincere pursuit of God to a tool for self-exaltation. So, it is the intentions for Pharisaic is to exalt their outward appearances and for self-exaltation, while it's the trap. The acts themselves, prayer, fasting, rule keeping, are not the problem. The danger lies in elevating personal convictions and human traditions about God's intent, turning worship into a performance for human approval. So the danger lies in elevating personal conviction and human tradition over God's intent. It is for the human approval rather than for the transformation of the heart. Okay, so the anatomy of the whitewashed tomb. So we see the exteriors of the tomb. We see this all the meticulous tithing, the ceremonial hand washing, the Sabbath observance, outward purity, and we see the interior, the seeking human admiration, pride, self-glorification, seeking human admiration, and lack of genuine comparison. So you see all those things that are hidden within the outward whitewashed tomb. So Matthew 23, it says, you are a whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, But on the inside, you're full of bones and of debt and everything unclean. So, pride, the three tombs, like pride, self-righteousness, and absence of compassion. So, religion as a status symbol, the belief that holiness is achievable through human willpower, leading to the pride of accomplishment. Self-righteousness is morality used as a benchmark for superiority, comparing oneself to the other rather than standard of God. So it's like they had a morality which they kept it as superior rather than to the standard of the God's holiness. When you talk about God's holiness, it's much more greater than man's attempts to be for the morality. And then you have a absence of compassion, valuing rules over human needs, enforcing extra biblical traditions. They had a lot of traditions that create burdens for others without offering support. So that's very important. So straining out a gnat but swallowing a camel, obsessing over minute ritual details while ignoring justice. So they uh, kind of looked at obsessed with minor ritual details, rather ignoring justice, mercy, and forgiveness, and faithfulness. So here we look the Pharisees in the tax collector, validation by contract. So you see his prayer. He says he believes they have no sin to confess. Uses the other person's failure to implicitly elevate their status, while as the tax collector pleads for mercy, humble dependence on God, goes home justified. So the insight is that the self-righteous ego requires someone worse to compare itself to. It cannot survive with an outcast. So the mechanism of exclusion, saving themselves, the fear of contamination, motive, they try to point at mistakes not to rescue the person who sins, but to rescue their own sense of security. The result, they use the other person's sin as a shield to protect their own ego, ensuring the sinners remains an outcast to confirm their own clean status. That's the Pharisees. The sinner mistake and all is not for them to bring them into healing or restore them, but is to point out the difficulties and also prove that they are outcast and confirm their own clean status. So the opposite, the heart of the prophet, the motive compelled by grief and love to restore, not to elevate themselves, the posture and edification rather than to create distance. The prophet identifies with Daniel. We have sinned. They stepped across the boundary line towards the marginalized. So they pulled run towards the fire to pull out the person risking their own reputation, like Jesus eating with the tax collectors. They seek to save the sinner from the sin. So the posture, the motive, and the goal is, to save is not that we to proclaim that we are higher, but we identify as the sinners. But to also the goal is to pull out people from destruction, even though their own reputation is at the cost. So the paradigm of correction, the Pharisaic stance, the superiority, self-validation, and pride, whereas the prophetic stand is for the compassion, love, and grief. So the distance, contamination, and grief, identification, restoration, like Nathan comforting David, and the Pharisee is to distance, condemn, and publicly shame. Decide alone exclusion, punishment, whereas the prophetic stance is repentance, healing, and averting destruction. And metaphor condemnation versus cure. The health inspector, Pharisees condemns a messy restaurant, looks at the patient with detachment, offers a citation, not a cure. And they matters more to the clean food matters more than the life. Whereas the compassionate healer diagnoses life-threatening illness, looks at the patient with urgencies, uses truth as a scalpel to heal, willing to get dirty to save the life. So, how do we process failure? Termination versus treatment is quite self-explanatory. Yes, in quarantine, exclude, whereas prophetic correction is diagnosis, surgery, and restore. And finally, shattering the facade, the modern implications, the morning of today is elevating personal convictions to universal laws and defining worth by moral performance rather than grace. Final takeaway, the ultimate call is to leave the pristine, isolated safety of the whitewashed tomb and step into mercy, compassionate, life-saving work of the healer. That's challenging, right? So the intent is not to show the outward morality and the purity of the law, but intent is to true righteousness is never an external propensity; it is a transformed heart. I hope you got the message from this presentation, and the true heart of the correction and the stance between the outward and between the inward. So I'm signing off here. Thank you for listening to me, and hope to get back.